Okay, morning everyone. We're going to look at Tom Holland's book, Dynasty, which I thoroughly recommend. It's called The Rise and Fall of the House of Caesar. And I'm calling the short little lesson today, The Thorny Problem of Succession. It's all going to be based on Tom Holland. So don't forget, when we're evaluating sources, for a start, Tom Holland wouldn't be considered, with all respect to him, as one of the top historians of Rome. A criticism of him might be that he's more of a popular history writer. That said, if Tom Holland is watching the screencast, I'm a huge fan of yours, Tom, and I listen to your podcast all of the time. That said, let's not forget, even when we're looking at top historians in the present, we would want to say that they're relying on patchy evidence, etc. So as we approach the exam, I'm just going to push that AO2 and remind you in your essay, you must question the sources or the modern historians. Okay. Moving on. What was the succession problem? Why is it so important? Why are we ending our course looking at it? Well, as we've said before, a lot of people feel as though this was the job that Augustus did least well, if I could use that term. And I think it's because inevitably that was going to be the case. There was confusion, wasn't there, on how to pass on these powers, because you could argue the powers were not systemic, they were personal, weren't they? They relied, as he says in Res Gestae, on auctoritas, and a combination of offices such as the tribunician potestas that we need to know about. How to pass this on was something that they were working out at the time. Now, one of the key things for you to decide is whether Augustus knew what he was doing and had a very clear plan, or whether it was having a degree of a plan and feeling his way. And you know I've said before that I prefer the latter interpretation, which is why I've said the Principate was in process. How to get someone to succeed him was not known. It wasn't tried and tested. It had never been done before. The closest we could say is perhaps Octavian taking over from Julius Caesar, but that was by no means assured, was it? And Julius Caesar had made no such plans to pass on his office as dictator to Octavian. Now, a big problem in the succession, as we've seen from our reading, is that people died. That was most unfortunate. And it began with the first chosen heir, didn't it, Marcellus? And Gaius and Lucius, who we're going to talk about today, that was particularly disastrous, because we can see in terms of the coinage and from other sources that Augustus really was relying on these two young men to take over. There was also the great problem of the fact that they maintained the illusion of the Republic. Why was this a problem? Well, we know in Res Gestae he talks about restoring the Republic. So because you have this illusion of the Republic and the failure to actually admit that there is some kind of imperial system, it confused people, didn't it? Because we had a kind of doublespeak going on. People talking about the Republic being in existence when clearly it wasn't any longer. And then the added problem that you got from your reading today is Tiberius himself. Now again, remember the evaluation bit of it. So Holland characterizes Tiberius as aloof, as a snob, as a cold Claudian, as a bad communicator, as a kind of fairly bitter, misanthropic and angry man. Now, of course, this might be the case, but once again, we have to be a wee bit suspicious of some of the sources, don't we? What is apparent, and I think that this is beyond dispute, is that he lacked Augustus's skill with the Senate. And that's something we'll see in the questions. So the questions are set today. I'm just going to briefly go through them and get some of the answers. So this signet ring incident, we come back to it time and time again. It is described in Suetonius as 23 BCE, isn't it? And it's a very interesting incident because it shows a kind of indecision in Augustus, doesn't it? On the one hand, we have Marcellus being made the heir apparent riding alongside Augustus in the chariot. Suetonius tells us that Agrippa was so angry that he went away to the east for a while because he was in the shadow of Marcellus. And then Augustus seems to change his mind and to give Agrippa the ring. Well, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because it shows that, again, Augustus is feeling his way to power. According to Tom Holland, this is because he realizes that the Senate are not ready to take this idea of kingship. And therefore, by giving the signet ring to Agrippa, who is clearly the second man in the empire, that shows that he is not simply favoring his blood and, having a kind of dynasty. It shows that he is looking for a safe pair of hands. And of course, Agrippa would have enormous auctoritas, not only because of his incredible military victories, but by this stage, he's also the foremost administrator in Rome, with an incredible record of building and constructing aqueducts, and really been seen as incredibly effective, both as an administrator and as a politician. Of course, the interesting thing is that Agrippa is of such lowly birth, and that complicates things a little bit. Now, moving on to number 2, according to Holland, why did Augustus choose Agrippa as Julia's husband? Well, again, doing the kind of AO2 thing and evaluating the sources, we've got to be a little bit skeptical of Suetonius, but there might be some truth in this. According to Suetonius, Maecenas, who is the kind of third man of Rome, tells him, "You've made Agrippa so powerful now, you must kill him or make him your son-in-law." Are we to believe that? It maybe feels a little bit apocryphal. Is it the case that he's keeping his enemies closer? Maybe, but also the evidence does seem to be that these two were lifelong friends, and there doesn't really seem to be any hard evidence of tension. It shows, doesn't it, this Roman ability to take people into your family. And I guess this is one of the successes of Rome, that it wasn't always purely biological and worrying about blood. Adoption allowed you to expand your family. And this, of course, is what had happened to Augustus when he was the young Octavia. On to number 3. Which details suggest that the imperial family were popular with the Roman population? Well, this was really interesting, wasn't it? We could see quite a lot about this. The fact that they were looking for the young Gaius to be a 14-year-old consul, I thought was really interesting. But also the welcoming of Augustus's power. The evidence does seem to be, doesn't it, that the population in general welcomed his power. We know that they rioted when he stepped down from being consul, don't we? So it seems to me, even beyond questioning the sources, that Augustus seemed to have a lot of popularity, and that this suggests, doesn't it, a drift towards kind of accepting kingship or monarchy or authoritarianism, however you want to characterize it, okay? Now I'm going to go on to number 4, which I've already touched on. The fact that Gaius was, they attempted to make Gaius consul at 14 shows just how far things had deteriorated if we take Tacitus's kind of view. This is extraordinary, isn't it? Putting a boy in charge. It literally is like making a boy prime minister, isn't it, at the age of 14. And so this kind of unveils, doesn't it, the mos maiorum, this idea of the ways of the ancestors. And I guess that's why Augustus is really angry and doesn't like it. Because in spite of all the fact that Augustus took away elements of the Republic, he always wanted to keep the facade of it, doesn't he? When we read Res Gestae, there's a desperate attempt, isn't there, to say, I did not dismantle the Republic. That's not how I want to be remembered. I want to be remembered as restoring the Republic. And this moment here really threatens to kind of bring that facade down and show, as Tacitus always argues, that power has become concentrated in one man and that Rome is effectively a dynasty at this particular point. So it shows that Augustus is smart. He realizes, doesn't he, that if he's going to keep this story going, he cannot allow gross elements of going against the traditions of Rome. Now, on to number 5. How does Holland suggest that Drusus was the more likely successor to Augustus? That is because Drusus seems to be the popular guy, doesn't he, Ella? He is, if anything, more successful militarily than Tiberius, although both of them are extremely effective, especially, guys, in terms of securing the frontier. Now, the two most dangerous parts of the frontier remain Germania, where Tiberius and Drusus both do a lot of work, Tiberius even more so, because it's going to be Tiberius after the Varian disaster, and also the Illyrica-Pannonia side of the empire, which would be kind of modern-day Austria and Yugoslavia, etc. You will recall that in the 30s, Octavian had gone to Illyricum to make his military reputation. What's interesting is that it wasn't really pacified. It remained quite a restive region. So the two brothers were both kind of military stars, Drusus more so. If we're to believe the sources, it would appear that Drusus was more popular, a better communicator, more charismatic, whereas Tiberius is usually characterized as kind of cold, Claudian, aristocratic, a little bit monosyllabic perhaps, and not someone who would be able to take over Augustus's rule, which requires incredible political skill. Now, there's a wonderful quote over here, reputedly belonging to Julia, who's Jana's favorite lady. "I only ever take on passengers after the cargo hold has been loaded." Now, this is very naughty. It gives a real insight into what a bad girl she was, wasn't it, Jana? Because what she's saying there is, even though I'm messing around with loads of guys and having sex with different people, I wait until I'm pregnant. Now, there are two ways of looking at this. Well, at least she's making sure that her children are the legitimate offspring of her husband. That would be the nice charitable way of looking at it, wouldn't it, Jana? The opposite way shows that she's incredibly cynical, isn't it? And it's a quote worth knowing in light of the Lex Julia. And we know that her father's trying to be this kind of stern, morality kind of guy. It's very important. It's like the British royal family today, trying to keep this facade for the press, etc. That's what Augustus is doing, isn't he? He's a master, we know, of image and PR. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, Julia is obviously not at all what he's making out that she is. Now, moving on to number 7, why does Tiberius finally snap? Well, according to Holland, it's this kind of tremendous sense of being in the shadow of Gaius and Lucius. And where's the support for this? Does Holland seem to be right? Well, if we look at Res Gestae, and we look at the way in which Gaius and Julius are described, it does seem as though there's more affection. And Monroe asked earlier about the coinage. Well, the amount of coinage with Gaius and Lucius, and this extraordinary title of Princeps Juventutis, which was certainly not given to Tiberius, seems to suggest, doesn't it, that there was a lot of favoritism towards the two young brothers, and that for whatever reason, Tiberius felt so put out that he leaves and retires to the island of Rhodes. Now, at first, this may not seem entirely disastrous, but following the death of Gaius and Lucius, now this leaves Augustus with an enormous problem, doesn't it? Not being able to kind of secure an heir, not being able to know what's going to happen. And we know from the mausoleum, and we know from Suetonius, that Augustus was very keen not to return to the days of the Republic. He saw that as inevitably resulting in chaos and factionalism. So he wanted to retain his principate with this kind of illusion of the republic, but with a kind of strong man at the middle who could sit on top of the apparatus of the Senate. So Tiberius goes away, and he only comes back later, doesn't he, after the deaths of Gaius and Lucius. These deaths, of course, are an enormous blow to Augustus's plans. It takes us back to the death of Marcellus. He's not going to have this kind of direct heir as he planned. And it shows the weakness, doesn't it, of the whole succession plan. I guess it was hard for it not to be weak because we had very high mortality rates, as we discussed. And this was always going to be a problem. Now, what's really important, I want you guys to do a little bit of reading of the next section, which is on page 32. When Tiberius does take over, he tries to use the same trick as Augustus. He goes into the Senate and he says, I don't think I'm equal to this task. I don't think I can do it. Do you remember? It's the trick that Augustus uses in the first constitutional settlement. But instead of working, it angers and confuses the Senate, and they don't know what the hell is going on. And it causes an awful mess. And everybody is upset. Holland says that this is because Tiberius felt totally overshadowed. But of course, the other alternative might be that Tiberius didn't feel ready for the role, and his actions in going to Rhodes do suggest he wasn't a natural leader. The point being is that right from the get-go, Tiberius doesn't get on with the Senate. He's not going to be like Augustus. He doesn't have all those little tricks of knowing every senator's name. And one of the first things that Tiberius does, guys, is that he abolishes the Comitia Centuriata, which is the elections for the magistrates. And that is why Holland tells us that Tiberius lacks Augustus's political genius and political skills. And this is going to be confirmed when a few years into his reign, if I use the kingly term, instead of staying in Rome, he retires to the island of Capri, where he very seldom is visited by senators, and he rules from afar. And again, next week going to go back to Tacitus, and I want you to see why Tacitus is so bitter and angry with Augustus. Because in particular, he feels that this succession is utterly disastrous. Okay, finally, just to briefly bring it all together, this section of Tom Holland's writing shows the weaknesses of the succession, perhaps the greatest weakness in Augustus's life and in his work. He did have a lot of bad luck. He lost a lot of his chosen heirs, as we've seen, in particular Marcellus in 23 BC, and then the loss of Gaius and Lucius, the loss of the Princeps Juventutis, being a huge blow to his plans. But of course there was also this problem, this inherent problem of how were these powers to be inherited. That was something that didn't seem to have been sorted out, possibly because it was impossible to sort it out. The system, as we've said, was awkward, it lacked clarity, and there was a problem of what it was. Were we actually talking about a republic? Were we talking about something different? This dynastic principle, however, had been firmly established. Now later, the Praetorian Guard are going to be very, very important in terms of the succession. So in your essay, you could mention that they will become a growing threat. Because the principle of succession is confused, it will allow a kind of power vacuum. And that's something that later on the Praetorian Guard will step into and start to decide who emperors are going to be. And of course, there's the problem of Tiberius himself. Certainly when we read Holland, who seems to be relying a great deal on Suetonius, and Tom Holland is now translated Suetonius, so I think that would be one of his main sources. Tiberius seems to be becoming increasingly autocratic, We know that he's going to move to Capri. We know that he's not going to have Augustus's scrupulous attention to detail and to cultivating relationships with the Senate. And we could argue that that is a systemic problem as well as one of personality. Thanks so much for listening.